Coming up, balancing corporate and government power.
Money has entered democracy and corrupted it so fundamentally that there's a giant thumb on the scale. And that's why the playing field's not level.
Former Clinton advisor David Rothkopf shares his vision for a more equitable society. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
It is our pleasure to welcome David Rothkopf to this public affairs program. David, who was recently appointed CEO and editor-at-large for Foreign Policy magazine, is also the author of several widely acclaimed books that have proven to be both timely and astute. This time, he writes about the defining political issue of the moment, which he sees as how to strike the right balance between private and public power.
We have come to a moment of such great import in terms of the direction of the world, economically, politically, in terms of who is going to lead and what direction that leadership is going to take us. And we are having a debate in the United States that is so absurd and so simplistic. And it's this George Orwell, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad kind of silliness, where one side is saying, leave it to the markets, and another side is saying, government can solve everything. And both sides are mischaracterizing their views. And nobody is having a serious discussion about the issues at stake. Both sides are pandering. You know, the President of the United States, a man for whom I have some considerable admiration on some issues, in the past couple of his State of the Union addresses would say over and over again, America is number one, America must be number one. It is, this is the critical issue. We can't fall behind. He would bring up China as it was the bogeyman. It wasn't actually a country. It was like something from a Grimm's fairy tale that lived out in the woods and would eat you if you weren't careful. Because China was out there and it was going to overtake us. And I think number one at what? Do we want to be the largest country in the world? Do we want to be the most powerful country in the world? Is that the way we run our lives? Do you say, I need to live in the largest house on the block? Or or is there something else? What kind of country do we want to be? What do we want to lead at? And it seems to me that's what we ought to be discussing. We ought to be sort of saying, what is the shape of the society that we want to have? And if it isn't what we want it to be, how do we change it? What has happened in the United States over the course of the past 10 years is not producing the society that we want to have. For the first time in American history over the course of the past 10 years, we've actually lost net jobs. For the first time in American history, social mobility is falling. Over the course of the past decade, and actually over the course of the past 3 decades, inequality is growing in the United States, and it's not getting any better. Citizens United, a court decision that perverts democracy by asserting that a right that is given in the Constitution to everyone, the right of free speech, actually isn't what we thought it was. Because if you equate money with speech, which is what the Supreme Court decision means, it means some people have a little bit more of that right than other people. They have more of an ability to, speak, to influence outcomes. And it leads to things like super PACs. We've gotten to that point where we have a society in which money has entered democracy and corrupted it so fundamentally that there's a giant thumb on the scale. And that's why the playing field's not level. And that's why the benefits trickle in one direction and not in the other direction. And at the same time, by the way, we're having a debate in which one of the candidates is arguing, because he's from the party that's against government, that we should have education not done by the government. At a moment where the majority of minority students who live in urban areas in the United States drop out of high school, which means they're out of the economy, which means they will never compete. They will always be a burden to society and deprived of the kind of dignity that human beings ought to have and the opportunity that human beings ought to have. But because it's ideologically in the interests of one party in the United States to say smaller government because it makes room in certain economic zones, they then take it to the next level and say that means get out of the area of education. What gives the average citizen a voice? Government. That's the idea. Government is a leveler. The whole story of the development of nation states and of democracy for hundreds of years was giving people a voice against super-empowered interests. And so my sense was, if the thumb is on the scale, and if things have gotten to this pass in the United States, how did we get here? What of what we are discussing today is new, and what of what we are discussing today is part of longer-term trends? And the conclusion that I drew was, you've got to go back into history. And why? Because, first of all, the last big struggle of the sort that we're seeing today ended 600, 700, 800 years ago, which was the battle between church and state. And now you may think, well, that was a battle between philosophies, or it was a battle about theology versus, politics. But that's not what it was. It was an economic battle. It was a battle over who controlled the ability to tax, who controlled the waterways, who controlled the fields, who was able to determine who got to put a mill where they wanted to put a mill. And it was two different systems for divvying up money and power, because those two things go together. When that battle was resolved, however, something interesting happened. A new actor entered the stage, because the nation states that were just budding up at that time wanted to build their economic power, and they created corporations, which they empowered to serve the state. And in this earliest incarnation, that was the idea, that the corporation would go out, it would collect money from doing whatever it was doing, usually trading, although in the case of one corporation, which I followed particularly closely in this book, which is the oldest corporation still in existence today, now called Stora Enso, once called Stora Kopparberg, which was a copper company that was born in Sweden in the Viking times. The idea was that these enterprises could produce revenue that would go into state treasuries and enable the states to be stronger. And I follow the story, and I sort of say, well, where did things evolve so that we got to the point that we're in today? One thing that you discover is that fairly early on in the history of corporations, you got struggles like you've seen today. And in fact, in the early part of the 18th century, there was something called the South Sea Island Bubble. And the South Sea Island Bubble was a scheme, a company that was created, and shares in the company were sold in the United Kingdom to go and sort of develop these islands in the South Pacific. And the bubble blew up. And a lot of people went broke. And there was a lot of finger pointing. And whenever there's a bubble, there's this same kind of debate. But something interesting also happens in the context of that. There's a bubble, there's this same kind of debate. Do corporations get their power reined in? They don't. It gets pulled back a little, and gradually more is acquired. And the one country that has done the most to empower corporations to a point where the power as it exists today is sort of hard to control was the United States. Because we were born with the Industrial Revolution. 1776 was not just the first date of American Revolution, it was also the date of the first patents that James Watt got on the steam engine. So the United States was sort of born of the industrial era, and it was born of a debate over what the shape of that country should be. And even in the earliest days, our forefathers, Thomas Jefferson, for example, warned that corporations, great corporations, that would have too much power. He wasn't alone, by the way. Lincoln said it, Theodore Roosevelt said it, Franklin Roosevelt said it, Woodrow Wilson said it, presidents throughout history, Louis Brandeis said it. They were worried that too much power would become undemocratic, that it would undermine the ideals of this government. But somehow, those with power got these ideas institutionalized. In the early part of the 19th century, there was a case about Dartmouth College, which would seem to have not much to do with corporate history, but what happened was that a charter was given, and the state wanted to take the charter away. And it was brought to the Supreme Court, where one of the people arguing the case was Daniel Webster, and they had a debate and determined that once a state gives a charter, it can't take it away. And what did that mean? Essentially, it meant that these corporations, designed to be immortal, right? That's the whole idea of having a corporation, is it outlives people. Now was starting to acquire a kind of immunity once it sort of left the womb of government. Next, big turning point was there was civil war in the United States, and the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War to ensure that African Americans who had been slaves would have the rights of other people, and that was the purpose. But in the first 50 years of the 14th Amendment being in operation, most of the cases brought for the Supreme Court using it were by corporations seeking to ensure that they would have the same rights as people. They're not just people, of course, because the reality is that if you are immortal, and I don't know who among you thinks you're immortal, but if you're immortal and you have massive resources and you've got legions of lawyers, you've got a lot of advantages operating within a society like this one. And that when you do that, you can influence the outcome of elections, or you can get laws passed that serve your interest. Now, what else happens? In terms of printing money, most of the value-bearing instruments in the world today aren't actually created by governments. They're created by the financial community. Most of them are derivative instruments, things you can't see, that you don't know who the counterparties are, that you don't know where the risk is associated with them. The number of countries that actually print currencies that are usable around the world can be counted on one hand. So, that most countries don't actually print money. In terms of projecting force, there are probably 16 or 17 countries in the world that can project force and sustain it for beyond their borders for a couple of days. Maybe 17. There's really only one that can fight a global war for any protracted period of time. So what do you call a country that doesn't have those core abilities? I would call it a semi-state. And if it doesn't have those abilities within its borders, think of how limited it is in dealing with big global actors like companies that have grown up to the size and scale of global corporations. Because we talk about markets as promoting competition. Markets don't promote competition. Adam Smith liked the idea of markets promoting competition, and he thought they would if it was small businesses. But if businesses get too big, and he railed against that, that actually quashes competition. And of course, what markets seek is efficiency, and the way you get efficiency is through scale. So big businesses do better, particularly on the global stage. And what's happened is corporations seeking scale have grown to a size that we never would have possibly imagined, where BlackRock, a money management firm, controls more assets than the Chinese central bank, which has more assets than any central bank in the world, where Walmart or Exxon have more financial resources than all but maybe 30 countries. If you were to ask who would have more impact over, say, the Kyoto protocols or global climate talks, Exxon or Sweden? The GDP of Sweden is roughly the same as the sales of Exxon, but Exxon's in twice as many countries as Sweden is. Exxon has dramatically more discretionary income than the Swedish government do in their budget. Exxon has much more political influence. In fact, there are a bunch of countries where if Exxon doesn't produce oil, those countries' governments don't stay in power. So you've got a situation where you've got a bunch of big companies. So many, in fact, that if you go to the number 2,000 company, it's bigger than 50 or 60 countries in this world. And so you've got semi-states, but you've also got super citizens, global actors, immortals, with enormous amount of resources. Does that mean, am I saying that countries can't control or influence or regulate or be a problem for companies? No, of course they can. Does it mean that things have gotten out of balance and there are places where the system isn't what we thought the system was? Things that we thought were once exclusively the realm of the public sector aren't. The wars we fought in the Middle East just now, in Iraq and Afghanistan, more than half of the people that the United States government had on the ground were contractors. It's the first time in our history that we've been fighting contractor wars. The world order is different, and the rules don't apply to this world order. And so this leaves us with a couple kinds of problems. How do you control it in the national level? How do you control it in the international level? Nationally, you've got this issue of democracy in the United States being corrupted by money. Internationally, we lack the institutions to do the regulation and to throw this thing back into balance. And any politician who suggests that we need to create stronger international institutions is thrown into a deep well. You know, I mean, because that's just, you know, the last thing that you're allowed to do in politics is suggest that we cede sovereignty upwards. This is a fundamental mistake, by the way. I mean, you come here and you listen to discussions about international affairs, and people talk about sovereignty like they're talking about religion, and that it's something that you want to hold close. But the reality is this: if we don't cede sovereignty upward, then we don't create institutions that control the global commons. And if we don't, then individuals have no influence over the outcomes there. So you need to create mechanisms that report to people in order to create outcomes that are chosen by people. But the other issue is that, you know, we, at the end of the Cold War, had a big party. We had this moment of wild euphoria. There had been this contest between a system that said leave it to the state and a system that said leave it to the markets, and the system that said leave it to the markets won. And, you know, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book, The End of History, and we, you know, went out and we partied in the early 90s and, you know, said, you know, we won and it's our way and American capitalism has triumphed. But what we've discovered is that that's not actually what happened. We are now in a world in which instead of a communist-capitalist competition, there is a competition among different kinds of capitalism. And there's capitalism with Chinese characteristics, and there's democratic development capitalism in India or Brazil, and there's small state entrepreneurial capitalism in places like Israel or Singapore or the United Arab Emirates. And there's European capitalism, which takes some forms in the southern part of Europe that are a little dysfunctional, but in northern Europe, which we used to laugh off. I mean, when I was in the Clinton administration, you know, you would talk, oh, Swedish Euro socialism, that's deader than a doornail. Well, not so much. If you look at the lists of quality of life in the world, and there are many such lists, the dominant countries on that list are Northern European countries. If you look at countries that are leading the way in terms of educational performance, or if you look at countries that are leading the way in terms of fiscal discipline, they're also on that list. So this is not free spending, wacky socialists. So one of the things that we're seeing here is that there are all these different systems, and the US system is an outlier. It's an outlier because we have, for the past couple of decades, promoted a system in which government's role is shrinking. And in these other systems, government is playing a bigger role, not just playing social safety net, but also in helping these countries to compete. We've got to sort of drop the sort of reflex reactions that we have in this country and say, what's working? What's fair? What produces the kind of society that we want to have? And we also have to stop assuming that, as was the case for the past 70 years, American capitalism and American views are going to dominate the way things are going to evolve going forward. That's not going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is that as you look over history, one thing that you see is as the economic center of gravity moves, so does the intellectual center of gravity move. And the economic center of gravity was in Europe, and that's where the intellectual center of gravity was for a long time, and that's why we study what's going on in Europe, or what happened in Europe in our schools. It was here for a while, and it's now moving across the Pacific. And if you want to see what the future of capitalism is going to look like, I don't think it's going to be Chinese capitalism. In fact, I don't think there is such a thing. You know, when you say capitalism with Chinese characteristics, what that means to me is lots of different kinds of capitalism, a lot of chaos, some of them very regulated, some of them not, some of them like the Wild West. But there are other versions of capitalism emerging, like the Singaporean version, that are gaining traction within China. And it could well be that we've been taught that the world is going in the direction of Milton Friedman, and it could be going in the direction of Lee Kuan Yew. And it could be going in the direction of a different kind of a model. And so we have to ask ourselves, first, what kind of a society do we want to be? And then, how do we change the system within the United States in order to ensure that we achieve that? And then third, how do we achieve our goals globally in order to ensure that we are protected against bad outcomes and we are able to advance our national interests and do so in a world in which it's not just nation states and it's public-private. And the punchline of all of this is not the same simplistic, silly discussion that we're having in the United States about one way being right or one way being wrong. It's about finding a balance and recognizing where the market has a constructive role to play and where government has a constructive role to play, not making silly statements that government is always bad and the less of it is more. Government is the only means of ensuring that the average person has a voice or a seat at the table in these things. That's why we have the system of democratic government. And so we need to preserve that as we do these other kinds of things. And that's the moment that we're at. Unfortunately, it is a moment, like moments that have occurred throughout history, where the rules of the system are out of date with the needs of the system. And so over the course of the next couple of decades, we are going to be remaking those rules. And what we should be aware of is that typically when that happens, you live in a period of big upheaval and uncertainty. And so that's why we found ourselves now in a period of upheaval and uncertainty. Lots of promise, even the possibility that an evolved American form of capitalism can continue to lead for decades to come, but there's a choice to be made. One here, internally, and also one on the international stage.
To what extent do you think that the problem of the national deficit, which is now close to our gross domestic product on an annual basis, will impact the ability of the government to react and to innovate and to meet some of the problems you've been talking about?
The only way to fix the United States national fiscal circumstance is to raise taxes, to cut defense spending, and to reform entitlement spending. And one party is against part of that, the other party is against part of it. And anybody who's balanced a checkbook knows you've got to do all of it. The United States has essentially made a choice, and I don't know if this is a choice that you made around your kitchen table, but effectively you did, which was we're going to spend the bulk of our money, the bulk of our tax dollars, on being the world leader in defense. That's, to me, this is just crazy. That's not the way I want to invest my money. I don't think that's the way that America is going to lead the world going forward. And so we've got to stop and recognize that sort of continuing in the same track that we've been on essentially is making certain decisions like that, and we can't afford it. And there's one other thing that we can do that makes a difference, and that is understanding the distinction between spending and investment. A dollar that goes into a bridge that's going to be there for 100 years is not the same as a dollar that goes into a government salary. And we, corporations typically have a capital budget, and we as a country would do well to have a capital budget. So we could say, yes, we are going to make some investment spending over here because that's going to help attract investment, that's going to help create jobs, that's going to help create a tax base. But what we've got to do is get beyond some of the nonsense of the discussion that we've been having, where people say, oh yeah, if you cut taxes, we'll make that up. That'll create the growth that you want to create. That'll create jobs. That'll free people to create jobs.
Sweden is a small country. They're 9 million now, 8 million 20 years ago. Singapore is even smaller. In both of those cases, the public-private partnership came about because they were able to develop consensus. And I wonder how you apply that to a country of over 300 million people.
You're absolutely right. Little societies have an easier time managing problems than big societies. And we are never going to be a consensus-managed society. Our system needs functioning local governments and functioning state governments and functioning national governments, and it's always going to have a degree of dissent in it. But I do think that we can make a move towards recognizing that there is an appropriate role for government to play. And that when government doesn't work, the answer isn't shut it down because it's got to play that role. It's how do we fix it? And when the private sector oversteps, the answer isn't shut them down. It's rebalance. Let's look after the interests of everybody else. I'm talking about nuance and readjustment. I don't think we need to reinvent everything here, nor do I think we need to slavishly follow other systems that aren't, appropriate models for our own.
What type of new institutions, both domestically and globally, would you envision to move toward a better social world, or do you just feel that we should strengthen the already existing institutions on both those levels?
Well, there are lots of different directions that we could go there, but I don't. First of all, I'm not advocating wholesale creation of new government institutions. There are some places where there are gaps. I mean, we need some kind of global regulatory mechanism for financial markets. So many transactions take place out in this unregulated space we need to deal with. We need some kind of global regulatory mechanism that deals with emissions and preserving the global environment. And you just have to deal with that on a global basis, and we don't have the mechanism. So there are a couple of new institutions that we would benefit from there. We also need institutions that sort of help translate the will of the people at large into the strategies we have for dealing with global issues. And we don't really have those in terms of security issues where, I mean, the UN and the other institutions created at the end of the Second World War were actually created to be weak. They were created to preserve our prerogatives, the United States and the other victorious nations. We've got to graduate towards having true global governance. And so that involves strengthening those institutions. In terms of our national institutions, again, I don't think we need a lot of new ones. I think we need more effective ones. That doesn't necessarily mean bigger ones. It means government institutions that actually are able to counterbalance power. And in fact, some of the things that I think would be best are doing away with things, doing away with this massive campaign finance octopus that is strangling American democracy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.